Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Bennett Tchaikovsky, and this is part 2 of our series. Well, it's actually really part 3 because there was a 0 was the introduction, but we're now going to be looking at the same question we looked at part 1, but this time we're going to be going through and using activity-based costing. So coming right over here, my disclaimer and copyright notice. Right over here is going to be the opinions in this presentation are those of myself and not my employers, including but not limited to the South Orange County Community College District and Irvine Valley College. The contents of this presentation do not constitute any legal or accounting advice whatsoever and are for educational purposes only. This presentation is copyright 2023 by Bennett Tchaikovsky. All rights are reserved. Any distribution without the author's prior written consent is strictly prohibited. So let's go over here to the Google Sheets and let's take a look at our question that's coming up for activity-based costing. So this is the exact same question we had in the first question we did over here. The only difference between these two right over here is the method which we're going to go through and use to allocate overhead. In single plant wide for this particular question, we did overhead based on the number of parts. And so we just said, okay, right over here, the total overhead cost was $3,250,000. The total parts was 1,000. The rate per part was $3,250. We then went through and allocated this. Really important when we're going through and doing activity-based costing, when we do the overhead allocation between the two different parts, it's going to have to equal up to $3,250,000. However, the way we're going to go through and get there is going to be different. So let's go ahead and look at this question again. We produced two models of electric bicycles, 30 kph and 50 kph. The 30 kph model sells for $3,000, while the 50 kph sells for $4,500 per unit. The direct materials and direct labor costs for each of the bicycles is as follows. 2,000 units of 30 kph are produced, while 500 units of 50 kph are produced. So let's go through and look at our chart. Okay, so over here. So the sales price for the 30 kph was $3,000. Over here for the 50 kph, it is $4,500 per unit. Remember, we're doing this all per unit. You've heard me say this. I'll keep on saying per unit. I do that for a very specific reason because I don't want you to make the mistake on tests. The per unit direct materials and direct labor cost for over here are going to be $1,500. And this is for the 30 kph. Over here for the 50 kph, the direct materials and direct labor costs are $3,000. Over here, we need to go through and basically figure out what is our factory overhead. And at the same time, what is going to be our gross profit using activity-based costing. Over here, we'll have to do the same thing for 50 kph. And we'll do this with a little purple. There we go. Okay. So this part over here, the sales price, right? The sales price, the direct materials and labor, this is the exact same as single plant wide. If we were doing departmental, it would be the exact same way as departmental. However, over here with activity-based costing, we need to go through and basically figure out how to allocate this overhead. But this time, we are not going just to be taking the 3,250 and multiplying it by one factor. So let's go ahead and take a look. So when we're doing activity-based costing, we're going to be going through and allocating overhead based on activity. So let's take a look at our activities going through over here. So our activities over here is we have setups. We have 200,000 in terms of that cost. We have forming. We have 1.4 million in terms of that cost. We have finishing, which includes testing, and it also includes assembly. We have departmental support, which is going to include purchase orders and will also include factory space. And when we go through over here, and I add up all of these lines right over here, I get 3,250,000. Remember, when we're going through and doing the overhead allocation, this number here in terms of total overhead, this is the dollar amount that we're going to have to allocate to our two basically products for this question. Again, remember, we were allocating earlier under single plant-wide total overhead, but we were dividing it here by one factor. For this question over here, we are going through and breaking this up. So under activity-based costing, what we need to kind of know and go through and kind of see is we've got our drivers, right? So our drivers right over here, we have number of setups, machine hours, number of tests, number of parts, purchase orders, and then lastly, we have units produced. What I'm going to now need to do is to figure out, well, what is my total driver amount? Okay. My total driver amount over here is going to be 100 for the number of setups, 100,000 for the number of machine hours, 200 for the number of tests, 1,000 for the number of parts, 200 for the number of purchase orders, and then 2,500 for the units produced. I'm going to ignore the driver use by product at this point. I'm not going to focus on that right now. I'm going to use that later to go through and do the allocation. But what I'm trying to do right now is I need to take the total amount of the driver, and I'm going to go over here, call this A3, we'll call this B3. If I take A3 divided by B3, I'm going to get C3, not PO. But over here, this is my rate per driver. So my rate per driver over here for activity-based costing, this is going to be 200,000 divided by 100, or 2,000 per setup. Over here, this is for 1.4 million divided by 100,000. This is going to be $14 per machine hour. That's the MH. Over here, the testing, 50,000 divided by 200. This is going to be 250 per test. The 1.2 million divided by the 1,000 is going to be 1,200 per part. Over here, this is going to be 500 per purchase order. And then this over here is going to basically be 300,000 divided by, and this is going to be per unit. Okay, so this is per PO is purchase order. Okay, so I've come over here and this is my rate per driver. So again, I'm taking the total amount of the category, and when I add up the categories, it has to equal up to my total overhead. That's what it has to equal up to. So I come over here, my total amount of my overhead, it's got to be equal over here. But then for each one of these categories, I'm going to divide it by the driver. So here it was setups. And again, I'm going to have to tell you in the question what the driver is for each part of each factor. 100 setups, 100,000 hours, 200 tests, number of parts, et cetera, et cetera. So this is going to be my rate per driver. Once I have this part over here, I'm now ready to go through and do my allocation. So for my allocation, the driver for 30 kph for setups was over here at 20. Okay, so I had 20 setups for 30 kph. When I take the 20, we'll call this D3. When I take C3, which is the rate per driver, times D3, this is going to give me my allocation. This is the 30 kph allocation. So I'm going to take 2,000 times 20. It's going to give me 40,000. This next one over here is based on machine hours. I had 70,000 machine hours for the forming area. So my overhead allocation is going to be 980,000. My driver over here for the number of tests was 30. So over here, I'm going to take my rate per driver, which is going to be 250 times a 30, and it's going to give me 7,500. Over here, I had 900 parts being used for the 30 kph. So this is going to be $1,080,000. Over here, I had 60 purchase orders. So this is going to be 30,000 allocation for the 30 kph. And then lastly, for over here, I had 2,000 in terms of units produced. So over here, my allocation over here to 30 kph will be 240,000. So the total amount of my overhead being allocated to this particular product is going to be $2,377,500. Now, if we've done this correctly, the amount that's being allocated over here to my 50 kph should be how much? Well, we know that the total amount allocated, right? This has to go over here and be 872,500. Why is that the case? Because after I'm done with this, the whole amount has to be allocated. But let's just go through and check to make sure we're in good shape. So for the 50 kph, my driver for the setups is going to be 80, right? Just another way to quick check our work. Driver here is total is 100. That's what I'm using over here to get to my total amount per setup. But when I'm going through and allocating it out, the 20 plus the 80 has to equal 100. Over here, I have 30,000 machine hours for the 50 kph. So my allocation is going to be my rate per driver times this over here. Okay. So this will be 30,000 times 14 per machine hour. Over here, the number of tests that I have for 50 kph was 170. The number of parts I had for 50 kph was 100. The number of purchase order I had for 30 kph was 140. And the factory space based on units produced was 500. So over here, I'm going through and I'm going to go ahead and just multiply these out. 1,200 per part times 100 parts, 500 per PO times the number of the driver. And then over here, this is 120 per unit times the 60,000. So when I add these amounts up, it equals 872,500, which if we remember over here, this is going to be the amount that we thought it would be, but we want to go through and make sure that we go through and check our work. I also may give you 3 products on an exam, but maybe not as many activities. So over here, what do we do now? Well, do we want to come over here and put the factory overhead as 2,377,000? No, right? And you've heard me say this before. Why not? Because this has to be on a per unit basis. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go over here and we're going to say that the total overhead allocated for the 30 kph was 2,377,500. I need to divide this by my 30 kph units produced of 2,000. So my overhead rate per unit is going to be 1,188.75. I need to do the same thing over here for the driver for the 50 kph allocation. So my total overhead allocated is 872,500. My 50 kph units produced is going to be 500 because that's how many units I produced. So my rate per unit of overhead is going to be 872.5 divided by 500, or a total of 1,745. So this is my factory overhead per unit for 30 kph. This is going to be 1,745. Let's make sure I get the right number here. That looks right. 1,745 factory overhead per unit for the 50 kph. So once I have these parts over here, now I'm ready to go to my chart. So when I come over here to go to my chart, I have over here the factory overhead. Of 1,188.75. Over here, I have 1,745. So my total cost per unit is now going to be, for the 30 kph, is going to be 2,689,000. For the 50 kph, it's now going to be 4,745. When I subtract the cost from the sales price, let's take a look at what we have. Okay, so this is my sales price minus my total costs. This is going to give me 311 per unit, 311.25 per unit. Over here for the 50 kph, I'm now going to have a loss of 245 per unit. Okay, so that is how we go through and do this using activity-based costing. Remember, the sales price, direct materials, and direct labor for this type of question are never going to change. What does change is the amount of the factory overhead per unit. And if we look at this over here, we made 2,000 units, and here we made 500. If I go through and using activity-based costing, what I'm seeing now is like, wow, this is really under this method where I was before, is that, well, the 50, this one here looked really profitable, right? I made 2,000 units at 37.50 was 75, and this one was at 8.50, and it looked like this was the big one. But as it turns out, when we start drilling down on how each of the units is going through and using or utilizing the factory overhead under activity-based costing, we've got a problem, because under activity-based costing, I am losing money. So typically what you will see is if a company is making a customized product, which in this case, we'll call this 50 kph, it's going to end up using more resources. So therefore, when you're going through and doing this, we want to go through and look at this and say, hey, wait a second, we may need to look at this more intensely. Now, because we're in such an inflationary period during 2023, we're going to be like the Ford Motor Company, and now this is going to be $9,000. So we're just going to jack up the price of our stuff. And this is now going to be $5,000, so that's what you would more than likely see happening. Obviously, we can't raise the price where a consumer would not want to buy it. But if we're an automaker oligopoly, why not? So let's take a look at our analysis questions. Now, one of the things I have not done here in this video is I've done departmental, right? I'm just going to show you, though, if I were to do departmental, how would we do it? If we were going to go through and doing departmental, we would be looking at the costs by department, right? And we would come over here, and then I would have to say, well, do the machining based on machine hours, do the finishing based on assembly, do the department support based on factory space. So in this one, it's kind of like you're doing 3 mini single plant wides. But what we're doing in departmental is we're taking the entire department and choosing one factor to go through and to do it. I'm not going to do that, though, for this video. However, if you would like to go through and leave a comment and you want me to do this the same question using departmental, I'm more than happy to go through and create it. But if you're taking my class, I'm not going to test you on it. At least this is the fall of 2023. So let's go over here and look at the analysis. Based on your results for single plant wide and ABC, what would you advise the manager of YYZ to do? Well, know that are essentially over here. And this is what's really important when you write answers for my class. When we used single plant wide, KPH 30 had a gross profit of $75 per unit, while I'm over here, while KPH 50 had a gross profit of $850. Excuse me, this is $37.50 and $850. Okay. Excuse me. This will be $37.50. Okay. However, when we used activity-based costing, KPH 30 had a gross profit of $311.25 per unit, while KPH 50 had a gross loss per unit of $245. Now, is it okay for companies to produce a product that is at a loss? Sure, as long as they know about it. And if we come over here to our friends at Rivian, and this again, we'll take a look at their financial statement. And if you want to look at some fun, this is a fun one to look at. If I look at Rivian Automotive, that makes those awesome cars that have like the little light that kind of comes on, like when you open up the door, you see like the little logo. It's like pretty sweet. I'm not sure if that's worth $100,000, but why not? Okay, so if I come down over here, we see that on their income statement, right? They do not have a gross profit. Rather, they are losing money when they are going through and selling cars. When they're going through and selling their vehicles, their profits have gone, they're not as bad as they were, but they are still losing money on their vehicles. So as we look at this for Rivian, excuse me, as we're going through and looking at this for Rivian, it's okay if they have a loss. By the way, Tesla was in the same position. However, if you are at a loss, it really comes down to what's your plan to reach profitability. So for our YYZ company, right, as we're looking at this over here, well, we had a loss per unit, but is there some pathway to profitability? So based on our results, what would you advise the manager of YYZ to do? So based on the activity-based costing, which will give a more accurate picture or accurate representation of the factory overhead per unit. Remember, going back over here when we were doing the very first overhead slide, right? What's the activity-based costing? The advantage is it's accurate, but it takes more money to go through and to figure it out because we're going through all these different computations. But based on ABC, which will give a more accurate representation of the factory overhead per unit, management should be aware of the loss per unit that KPH 50 is experiencing. Okay. And should either consider increasing the price or potentially reducing production. So those are some suggestions, but notice what I've done over here. Whenever you're giving an answer, and this is something that's really important when you're doing any kind of an essay for an accounting class or when you're at work, you need to use numbers, quantify your results. One of my former students came in and he spoke with my one of my classes. And what I loved, he had his resume. And what was really awesome about his resume, and I didn't even notice this, but he started quantifying on the resume his achievements. That is something I would absolutely do. So this part of the question right over here, what would I go through and do? You want to first make sure you say what the results were. Say what you came up with these numbers, say what they are. Then you can kind of go through and conclude, because this one over here has a loss per unit. Now, this one over here is a little bit more interesting. Instead of using parts for single plant wide, would there be another cost would be better used to allocate overhead? So what is this question really asking? So when you look at this over here, if you notice that in terms of single plant wide, we chose to do this based on parts. When we did this based on parts, what happened to us? Well, when we looked at the parts, it basically said, well, we're basically making an overhead allocation based on roughly about 36% of total overhead. Remember, when we are going through and doing single plant wide, we're choosing one factor, which in this case, I basically said it was parts, and we're basically using that as the single plant wide overhead rate. But could machine hours have been a little bit more realistic? If we would have said over here that, well, machine hours represents roughly 43% of overhead, would the machine hours have been a better choice in terms of going through and allocating overhead? Possibly, right? And let's just kind of go through and see if what would have happened if we're actually going to get closer to the ABC numbers. If I were to go through and to do this, and by the way, when you're answering this question, if you're in my class, what you may want to say is this. You'd say possibly the company should consider using machining as the machining costs of 1.4 million are approximately 43% of total overhead, right? Which is 1.4 million divided by 3.25 million, as opposed to the parts, as opposed to, I think it's the assembly. Yeah, as opposed to assembly, which is approximately 36%. Is that what the number we came up with? But actually almost 37% of total overhead. For this question, this is all you would have to go through and answer, right? So if I say, is there a better one to go through and use? This would be the answer. But remember, whenever you're giving an answer in my class or you're at the office, let the numbers talk. Take the personality out of it. If you're using numbers to justify what you're doing, and if you show someone numbers, it's very different saying to somebody, well, we have to do layoffs. No one's going to like that. You have to say, well, we're going to do layoffs or we're going to run out of cash tomorrow. Well, we don't really have a choice. So going back over here, if I were in fact to go through and to do this based on a single plant wide basically a single plant wide rate based on machining hours, and it's doing this as kind of a little quick and fast way right over here. So if I take this and I say, okay, we've got machining hours. So we're going to take the total overhead on a single plant wide rate. My machining hours are 100,000. My rate per machine hour is going to be 32.50. How does this get allocated? Well, we've got 70,000 for 30 kph. And we have 30,000 for 50 kph. These are the drivers. which are machine hours. So right over here, and then I would say my rate per machine hour, it's going to be 32.50. Again, you do not have to do this for the question. I'm just following through. So over here, you now have total overhead allocated. And this makes a little bit more sense, right? Because now we're at 3,250,000, right? So, and now I have to do, but I have to do this on a per unit basis. My units for the 30 kph for 2,000, for the 50 kph for 500. My rate per unit is going to be 1,137.50. And this is 1,950. So what's interesting is that as we're going through and doing this over here, instead of using parts, if we're using machining hours, we're now going to be running at a slightly higher profit than activity-based costing, but we're still running at a loss for this particular product. So believe it or not, if we had used machining hours, we wouldn't have gotten this kind of funky result of this as being profitable. Rather, we're choosing something over here that's going to be more representative activity-based costing. Now, notice over here too, if you look at the parts that we're going through and used, this is 90 to 10. So the split of the overhead is going to be 90% and 10%, whereas this is going to be a 70-30. But again, you're not going to really know this until you kind of go through and do the computations. So, but again, this is not required for the problem, but if we wanted to have something that comes by that's closer to activity-based costing, this is something we could go ahead and do. And by the way, if the numbers, when we go through, if they're the same under single plant-wide as activity-based, or they're relatively close, which would we do? Well, you probably would want to go through and do single plant-wide because you're getting the same results as activity-based, and it's a lot easier to go through and to calculate. So my very long-winded explanation is going to go through and end there. Have a great evening wherever you might be. I look forward to seeing you on the next video. If you would like to see the departmental question worked out, feel free to leave a comment below. And I look forward to seeing you on future videos. Have a great night.